George Harrison, the so-called quiet Beatle, was anything but quiet when it came to the people he couldn't stand. Behind his gentle smile and soft-spoken image, he carried grudges that lasted decades. Some were aimed at the very people he once admired. Others were directed at bandmates who treated him as less than an equal. And then there was one final name, the person he despised more than anyone, tied not just to music, but to the dark temptations of fame itself. George Harrison was born in Liverpool in 1943, the youngest of 4 children in a working-class family. His father drove buses, his mother loved to sing, and for George, music became more than just a hobby. It was his lifeline. He spent hours listening to American rock and roll records, strumming on a cheap guitar until his fingers bled. At school, he wasn't known for being the loudest or the brightest, but when it came to music, he had a spark that no one could ignore. By 16, he had left school to work as an apprentice electrician. It was a job he hated, but one that gave him time to chase his real passion. And that's when he got his big break, joining John Lennon and Paul McCartney's band, The Quarrymen. What started as a small skiffle group in Liverpool would soon transform into the Beatles, the band that would change music forever. But while the world saw George as part of the Fab Four, inside the band he often felt like the outsider. Lennon and McCartney dominated the spotlight and controlled most of the songwriting. Ringo had his charm as the lovable drummer. George, meanwhile, was pushed into the background. Reporters nicknamed him the Quiet Beatle, and that label stuck to him for the rest of his life. To fans, it meant mysterious and calm. To George, it meant overlooked and ignored. The truth is, George wasn't quiet by nature. He was restrained. Even when he grew into a songwriter capable of delivering classics like Something and Here Comes the Sun, the band only allowed him 2 or 3 songs per album. Each time one of his tracks was cut or tossed onto the B-side, his frustration deepened. Behind the polished image of the Beatles, George was quietly seething at being treated as less than equal. The breaking point came just before their legendary American debut on The Ed Sullivan Show. George had caught a serious throat infection, and doctors ordered him not to speak a word until the performance. That night, the Beatles made history, but George's forced silence became symbolic of his career. The world saw him as the calm, quiet figure in the background, when in reality he was fighting to be heard. Over time, these small cuts built into deep resentment. To George, it wasn't just about music. It was about being dismissed, about being underestimated, and about watching his contributions brushed aside while others were celebrated. Those wounds never fully healed, and they shaped the way he looked at people for the rest of his life. And it wasn't only inside the Beatles that George's faith in people began to break. Even his childhood hero, the one who first inspired him to play music, would eventually let him down in a way he never forgot. For George Harrison, Elvis Presley wasn't just another musician. He was the spark that lit the fire. As a teenager in Liverpool, George recalled riding his bike past a house and hearing a sound drifting through an open window. It was Heartbreak Hotel. Just a few bars were enough to change everything. George later admitted, "When I first heard Elvis, I knew I was never going to be the same again." Like millions of other young people in the 1950s, Harrison was captivated by Elvis's raw energy, his voice that could shift from a whisper to a shout, and his rebellious image. To George, Elvis wasn't just an entertainer. He was proof that music could be powerful enough to break through the monotony of everyday life. The Beatles themselves admitted they probably wouldn't have existed without the influence of Presley. So when Harrison finally had the chance to meet his idol years later, he expected magic. Instead, what he found broke his heart. The free-spirited rebel who once defined rock and roll was gone. In his place stood a man in a glittering white jumpsuit. surrounded by backup singers, horns, and the glitz of Las Vegas showbiz. What George had once seen as authentic now felt like a hollow performance. After the encounter, he confessed to friends that all he wanted was for Elvis to strip it back. No costumes, no flashy production, no Vegas theatrics. He just wanted the Elvis of the 1950s again. A man with a guitar standing alone and singing. "That's all right, Mama." But the remark didn't stay private. Word reached Presley's circle, and according to those close to him, Elvis was not amused. With a cold smile, he supposedly muttered, "If he thinks I'm going back to playing in little bars just to please somebody, then he doesn't know a thing about Elvis Presley." That moment was the end of the illusion for Harrison. Elvis wasn't the hero he once imagined. He had become, in George's eyes, a product of the machine, polished, commercialized, and far removed from the authenticity that first inspired him. For Elvis, it was just another critic. For George, it was devastating. The man who had shaped his dreams had turned into a symbol of everything he despised: fame without sincerity. And from that day on, George carried a quiet bitterness toward Presley. But if disappointment in an idol hurt, betrayal within his own band cut even deeper. Because the next person on Harrison's silent blacklist wasn't just a hero, he was supposed to be a brother. When George Harrison first crossed paths with Paul McCartney, the two were just teenagers riding the same bus to school. Paul noticed George carrying a guitar and quickly realized this younger boy wasn't just a fan. He was talented. They began sitting together, trading chords, working out songs, and spending hours trying to copy the American rock tunes they loved. Paul even called him his kid brother. In those early years, there was no rivalry, only brotherhood and the thrill of discovering music side by side. But as the Beatles grew, so did Paul's dominance. By the time the band reached its creative peak in the mid-1960s, McCartney had taken control of much of the group's sound. His perfectionism pushed sessions late into the night, and he demanded multiple takes until every note sounded exactly as he wanted. For John, that was tolerable. For George, it was suffocating. Time and again, Harrison's songs were pushed aside. Even as he matured into a strong songwriter with gems like "While My Guitar Gently Weeps" and "Something," he was still treated as a junior partner. Albums might feature a dozen Lennon-McCartney tracks, but George was often limited to just 2 or 3. To him, it wasn't just about being overshadowed, it was about being ignored. The breaking point came during the Abbey Road sessions in 1969. Paul, as usual, tried to shape and polish Harrison's work, but George refused to bend. Their arguments grew heated, with Paul later admitting, "The trouble is, I always thought our songs were better than George's, but now his are at least as good as ours." George didn't hold back either. In frustration, he snapped, "I'd rather have Willie Weeks play bass than Paul McCartney. That's the truth. I respect Paul. He's a great bass player. But sometimes he's just too overpowering. I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but not with Paul." Even years later, the sting of those sessions lingered. In interviews, Harrison claimed Paul had ruined him as a guitar player, forcing him into patterns that stifled his creativity. And yet, for all the bitterness, there was still an undeniable connection. George admitted, "I just know that no matter what we've been through, there's always something that ties us together." It was a strange contradiction, resentment and loyalty bound together. With Paul, the relationship was never cleanly broken. But with John Lennon, things were different. That bond, once built on admiration, decayed into open dismissal and wounds George never truly forgave. For George Harrison, John Lennon wasn't just a bandmate. He was the reason George ever dreamed of being a musician in the first place. In his youth, George saw Lennon as larger than life, sharp-witted, rebellious, effortlessly cool. Joining John's band was like stepping into the orbit of a star. Lennon became the older brother George never had, the figure he sought approval from in every rehearsal and recording session. But idolizing Lennon came with a price. From the very beginning, John treated George like the kid of the group, often dismissing his opinions or mocking his ideas. Even as George's guitar skills improved, Lennon rarely gave him credit. For George, that stung, especially because all he wanted was respect from the man he admired most. By the late 1960s, the cracks had deepened into open wounds. Lennon often arrived at sessions disinterested, distracted, or under the influence, leaving George to carry the weight of arrangements and instrumentation. Instead of acknowledging George's contributions, Lennon pushed him further into the shadows. When Harrison finally began writing songs worthy of standing alongside Lennon-McCartney classics, John brushed them aside as if they were second tier. The tension spilled into personal life as well. Harrison, who had embraced meditation and spirituality through his friendship with Indian sitar master Ravi Shankar, found Lennon's cynicism unbearable. Lennon mocked George's devotion to Indian culture, calling it trendy, and even accused Harrison of preaching. To George, spirituality wasn't a fad, it was his anchor, and Lennon's ridicule cut deeper than Paul's perfectionism ever did. The fallout became painfully public after the Beatles' breakup. Lennon openly dismissed Harrison's solo success, saying his hit album All Things Must Pass was only strong because he had stockpiled songs the Beatles never wanted. Harrison in turn lashed out in interviews, hinting that Lennon's supposed brilliance was fueled by bitterness and self-destruction. Still, beneath the anger was heartbreak. George had once looked up to Lennon like a hero, and it's harder to forgive a fallen idol than a rival. Late in life, George admitted the complexity of their bond. John and I had a very love-hate relationship. He could be wonderful, and he could be a right pain. But I loved him anyway. Yet even love couldn't erase the resentment. Lennon remained the thorn in Harrison's side, the reminder of how admiration could sour into disillusionment. And if Lennon symbolized the betrayal of a hero, the next figure in George's story represented something even darker, the person he came to despise most of all. For all the tensions George Harrison endured, the power struggles with Paul, the heartbreak of losing respect for John, even the stings of critics, none compared to the contempt he felt for one man. This wasn't just another musician or a rival songwriter. This was someone Harrison had once welcomed into his home, shared a stage with, and even helped launch into stardom. And yet George would come to see him as the ultimate betrayer, Eric Clapton. At first, their friendship seemed unshakable. Clapton admired Harrison's subtle guitar work, and George respected Clapton's fiery blues style. The two even collaborated on tracks, with Clapton famously playing the soaring solo on Harrison's While My Guitar Gently Weeps. But beneath the surface, something was festering. A betrayal that had nothing to do with music. It was Pattie Boyd, George's wife, his muse, the woman who inspired something. The love song Frank Sinatra once called the greatest ever written. Clapton became infatuated with her, obsessed to the point of madness. He poured his feelings into songs like Layla and Wonderful Tonight, an open declaration of his love for another man's wife. For George, it wasn't just personal betrayal. It was humiliation. His supposed friend had turned his private heartbreak into a public soundtrack. Boyd eventually left Harrison for Clapton, a move that shattered what was left of their friendship. Even though George maintained a public front of forgiveness, joking at parties that he and Clapton had swapped wives, those close to him revealed the bitterness never faded. Clapton, in George's eyes, embodied everything he despised about the rock and roll lifestyle. Indulgence, betrayal, and selfishness dressed up as artistry. Clapton wasn't just the man who stole his wife. He was the man who turned George's deepest wound into an anthem and got praised for it. Even decades later, Harrison's feelings hadn't softened. In interviews, his tone toward Clapton was clipped, dismissive. He would compliment the music when pressed, but there was no warmth, no brotherhood. The quiet Beatle had no problem holding a grudge, and Clapton was the grudge that never truly healed. And so when people asked George who he despised most, it wasn't the critics who mocked him, or even the bandmates who overshadowed him. It was Clapton, the friend who crossed the line no one should cross. Because in the end, Harrison could forgive rivalry. He could forgive rejection. But betrayal, especially from someone he once called a brother, that George Harrison never forgot. George Harrison spent his life searching for peace, both in music and in spirit. But when it came to betrayal, he was unflinching. Paul may have dismissed him. John may have ignored him. But Eric Clapton had crossed the deepest line. For the quiet Beatle, forgiveness might have been a virtue, but forgetting was impossible. And maybe that's what makes Harrison so fascinating. He wasn't just the gentle mystic hiding in the background. He was a man of loyalty, of pride, and yes, of grudges. The truth is, even the quiet one had a voice, and sometimes that voice spoke loudest through the people he chose never to forgive. Now I want to hear from you. Do you think Harrison was right to hold on to that grudge against Clapton, or should he have let it go in the name of peace? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading them. And if you enjoyed this look behind the curtain of Beatle history, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around, because there's a lot more to uncover about the legends you thought you knew.